can start. Briefly, my name is Tim Pickering. I'm president of the board of trustees of the foundation. I want to thank you all for coming. These lectures are a critical part of our mission, and we are thrilled to be able to provide them to the community. I want to thank Kathleen for coming today. It's very exciting for me personally. Ever since reading her book, I've been wanting to get you here and have you answer some questions for us and tell us more. So thank you. I want to thank my fellow trustees who are here, Jeff Schwartz and Carol and Deb, all of you for joining along, so thank you. And finally, I want to thank BJ and Chrissy. They've done a great job taking over for our wonderful Linda Jenkins, previous director, and appreciate all the work you're doing, BJ, and settling in.
Oh, very much.
So,
thank you much, Tim.
BJ, thank you for doing this.
Thank you, thank you. And well, thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciate that you're all here to witness this really interesting topic. I'm really excited to dig into this because I was actually introduced to it from Tim Pickering here, and I was really excited to read this book, and then of course really excited to bring Kathleen in. And we've been getting to know her. She was here yesterday as well for a. These are chatter lectures. Well, we did a serial lecture yesterday with some kids where she read from her own authored and illustrated children's book. She is someone of many talents in this way. She ultimately though she's a native of New York and now is living in Maine with her husband Stan. She's very glad to join us here today. She's an author, illustrator, professor. She received her PhD from Rockefeller College at SUNY Albany in upstate New York, and so she has had lived many lives in many different roles, and excitingly, especially when it comes to this role of Colonel Tim. This event that you're going to hear, she is a descendant of the players in this event, if you will. I'll leave it at that to allow her to expound more upon this, but it is a very fascinating story, and I hope you all sat with rapt attention. This is the final lecture series we have here for this season, but we are going to be coming around again next year, of course. But just to keep all on your radars for Easter, on April 19th, we're doing an Easter event here. So keep that in mind, and keep paying attention to our emails and social media and all such. But without further ado, to introduce Kathleen.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. I was so excited when I heard from Timothy Pickering. I contacted my kids. I said, "You won't believe who I got an email." I thought he was dead. But anyway, has anyone read my book? Okay, I have copies. I'm going to give them to you in return for a donation to the Pickering House.
Oh, sure.
So I've got 10 of them. So and you can kind of follow along. You can pass them around. So the story behind this book is basically that I was trying to find my own ancestor. I have an ancestor named John Earle. My maiden name is Earle, and the book is under my maiden name, who was born in 1795 in Geneva, New York. And in the 70s, I started researching my family. I was between husbands, and I was bored, so. But anyway, so I couldn't find anybody who might be his father. Geneva was pretty wild and woolly in 1795, and they barely had schools. But anyway, I kept looking, and I looked for 40 years, and I found a distant ancestor who's a Mormon, and she came east, and we couldn't find anything at all. And then I got married, I had more kids, and then I had another break about 6 years ago, and I went through my piles of volumes of material, and I found a reference to the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania. So I contacted the Historical Society down there, and I said, "Do you have any Earles down there?" And they said, "Only the kidnappers." I said, "I'll be right down." So basically, my ancestors were involved in the kidnapping of Timothy Pickering. I told my kids I was coming here, and they said, we Zoom with the kids every couple weeks. And they said, "Uh-oh, they're gonna capture you because my Earle's got away." So be careful what you do. But anyway, okay, we can start the slides. This is John Earle. First slide. He was, that's the guy who was born in Geneva, New York. And this is all I knew about him. I went to Cornell University. I never knew I had ancestors in that area at the time. My family never said anything about our background at all. I had no idea. I didn't even know what we were. I was jealous of the kids who could say they were Italian or French. My name's Kathleen, so I told everybody I was Irish, but I'm really not. Kind of just whatever, you know. So we didn't know what we were or who we were, but we did know. I found out later that this guy was born in Geneva, and he was kind of a big deal. And for a small town, he had town. He served at the town, whatever, hard catcher, whatever they did. He owned a farm, and the farm owned land around Taconic Falls. If you've been in Ithaca, that's a really big falls. But they had a lot of kids, only one boy, so they sold off the land. So he was in the War of 1812, and he had 7 kids, and his son, my great-grandfather, had supposedly done a genealogy, his grandson, and destroyed it. So that was the only thing I knew, and he had an E to the name. It was originally Earle without an E. So that was kind of intriguing. The other person in the story is Timothy Pickering. So next slide. And you all know about Timothy Pickering, I assume. He was kind of a big deal. I think this is from your website for the House. That he served in the American Revolution, and he was a senator and a congressman, and he was into naming boats, I guess. And he was born and died in this house, and he's buried across the street. I was going to check out the grave before we leave. The next slide is the Pickering house. This house, originally in 1660, was kind of reddish colored. I really like it better now, gray. Well, anyway, only a few facts here. If you can see these, he was born here. He served in various roles. He bought land in the Wyoming Valley in 1784. That's an important part of this whole story. He moved to Wilkes-Barre, PA. This is all that's important in my story. That he moved to the Pennsylvania area in 1784. He bought land there, and then he moved there in 1787. And then on the night of June 26, 1788, he was abducted from his home by 15 young men. So the kidnapping is the next slide. We're going to jump right to that, and then I'll go into the background. That was his house in Wilkes-Barre. It was quite a grand house, and it was torn down in 1931. But before it was turned down, somebody took a lot of pictures of it. But let me read to you from my book. This is page, first page, The Kidnapping. On a steamy June night in the year 1788, Timothy Pickering was standing in his bedroom in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, his feverish 9-month-old son in his arms. That was Edward. Suddenly the door was pushed open and someone shouted, "Get up!" Rebecca Pickering jumped out of bed, threw on a robe, and ran to the kitchen to get a candle. When she returned, she and Timothy saw in the dim candlelight several young, black-faced men with feathers stuck in their hair. Some had handkerchiefs tied around their heads. They flourished knives, guns, and tomahawks. These were the wild Yankees, young white men who stormed out of the tangled hills along the Susquehanna River to attack their Pennsylvania neighbors. In Pickering's own words, their first act was to pinion me, tying my arms together with a cord above my elbows and crossed over my back. To the middle of this cord, they tied another long enough for one of them to take hold of to prevent my escaping. And then it goes on past the slide. Pickering was lagged by rope through the sleeping town of Wilkes-Barre, flanked by boys on every side. Pickering counted 15. After a walk of several miles up the Susquehanna River, they stopped at a Pittstown tavern for some whiskey. This is apropos of your story that you told. The boys offered whiskey to their captive, but, bragged Pickering, I told them I wanted water. If you want to add anything. Okay, so now while continuing quietly through the silent town, one of the captors said to Pickering, "Now, if you will only write 2 or 3 lines to the executive council, they will discharge Colonel Franklin, and then we will release you." So this is what's behind the whole story. Pickering replied haughtily, "The executive council better understand their duty than to discharge a traitor to procure the release of an innocent man." So, who was Franklin, you may ask? He was not related to Benjamin Franklin, but he was a big hero at the time in the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania. This was part of what's called the Yankee-Pennamite War. And how many people have heard of the Yankee-Pennamite War?
No.
Yeah, people who've read the book. The Yankee-Pennamite War, nobody else. Up in Maine, I sometimes volunteer at the lighthouse at the end of our peninsula. We get people from Pennsylvania, and I said, "Have you heard of the Pennamite Yankee War?" None of them have. I don't know what happened, but it was a pretty big deal at the time. Okay, you're a little bit ahead of yourself, but that's okay. It was between the Pennamites, who were settlers of the land granted to William Penn by King Charles II. The Yankees were settlers of the land granted to Governor John Winthrop by King Charles II. More about that, okay? Another thing about Timothy, you probably know this, but he had, at the time he was in Wilkes-Barre, he had 6 children already with Rebecca White. And Edward would go on to die at age 6. He died at age 6. And another child died at 12. He was 4 at the time. Okay, what were the events that led to the kidnapping of Timothy Pickering? Well, King Charles II became king in 1660, the same year this house was built. Now think about that. That's pretty hard to comprehend, isn't it? It's amazing. Oliver Cromwell got rid of Charles I, and Charles II was living in France. And so when Cromwell died, he came back. And he was kind of a wild man, Bacchanalian type. And he was unpredictable, and the Connecticut people were afraid that he was going to take over the colonies. So Governor Winthrop rushed over to England in 1662 and asked King Charles if he would guarantee that he would not take over Connecticut. And King Charles said, "You can have it all the way to the South Sea, to the Pacific Ocean." So this was Connecticut.
And they cut it short.
Yeah. And in 1725, New York said, "Well, we own this piece." So they said, "Okay, it's not that piece. All the rest, we own the rest."
Can I stop you? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Winthrop's associated in my mind with Boston. So what is he doing
got
dealing
all
with
over.
Connecticut?
He was the governor. Maybe it was a related person. I'm not a historian at all.
I
just know that Governor Winthrop, is the one who was.
I think it might be his son. Or one of his sons. One of the Winthrop that we understand of as the one around here. I believe one of his sons took over governorship of Connecticut at
Yeah,
one
I'm
time.
not sure.
Different
the Winthrop
person.
genealogy.
Okay.
Related, but yes, yeah.
The
Okay.
Winthrops are all over the place. I think I'm related to one of them too.
Yeah.
Back there, but
It also makes sense too about there being mixed, basically contradictions and inaccuracies between the 2 charters as well too. The mapping was so poor at that time that
I had no
Winthrop,
idea.
yeah, Winthrop obviously had this for Massachusetts Bay Colony around Salem,
Oh,
Boston.
right.
Folks out in Plymouth had their own separate charter as well too, Plymouth Bay Colony.
Yeah.
And then of course all these folks from Connecticut having their own separate one, and then you start going west and the lines get fuzzy.
Right. But in any case, he gave them that, and he also told them that they could, that they were free men and they could have it forever and it wouldn't be sold and it was theirs forever. So then, forgetting or not thinking about it very hard, in 1681, he gave Pennsylvania to William Penn. And there was an overlap, but nobody paid much attention to that. So there's the boundaries as we know it. So if you look at Pennsylvania, circled there, the top half belonged to Connecticut. Obviously, there was an overlap with both Connecticut and Pennsylvania having legitimate claims in the northern part of Pennsylvania. And they also paid the Iroquois the Haudenosaunee for land, both Connecticut and Pennsylvania. So they really, really owned it. Okay, next slide. So who lived there at the time? The Haudenosaunee. And I'm sure you've learned a lot about the Haudenosaunee from just going through the Pickering house. You learn a lot. There's a lot of information here. They were very powerful. Basically, they were communists. You know, they owned the land in general, and in the Seneca were on the west door, the Mohawk on the eastern door, the two little brothers, Cayuga and Oneida, and Onondaga were the middle. The Tuscarora joined the league in 1722 when they were chased out of the South by the whites. They were very powerful, and people were scared of them. If a Mohawk would just go and stand on a hill overlooking a Massachusetts village, the village would clear out. I'm talking Massachusetts native people, not white people. They were very, very powerful and very feared. And the Wyoming Valley happened to be part of their hunting ground. So these population figures are there just as a curiosity.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. In 1650, the total population was 25,000. In 1791, it was 4,500. But now it's 14,000 people living on the reservations, not all enrolled. Do you understand about enrollment? Anybody interested in it? In order to declare yourself a member of the Haudenosaunee, you have to really be enrolled. I have Cayuga ancestors, supposedly, but I'm unenrollable. It's matrilineal, has to go through your mother. Mine is through the Earle side, and it's percentage. So to be a Cherokee, you have to have your land on it. After the Trail of Tears, they sign an allotment act. If your ancestor's name is on the allotment act, you can join the Cherokee. So a lot of the Cherokees are like 132nd or 164th Indian. They're white, blue-eyed people, but they're still Cherokee. But for the Haudenosaunee, it's dependent on matrilineal, definitely. And the Apache are patrilineal. So if, you have an Apache and a Haudenosaunee get married, and they're the wrong way. But in any case, that was who they were, and that's who they still are, pretty much. They've really gotten a lot of their power and recognition back over the years, and they're wonderful people. I've worked a lot. I was director of the National Indian Child Welfare Association in Portland, Oregon for several years. NICWA, you know NICWA?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, Terry Cross is Seneca, is the director. And when I was a professor, I met him at a conference. He said, "Oh, Cayuga." I said, "Well, not really, because it's 1/16 or something." And through my father, he said, "That's okay. It's okay with me, So I worked there for several years. And then fairly recently, I took a DNA test. I had no Native American. So I called up Terry. I said, "Terry, I'm really sorry. I'm not Indian at all." They use Indian, so. But anyway, he said, "That's okay. It's oral history." We're interested. He said, "None of us have any, Another thing about the Haudenosaunee is that they would adopt people to replace people who were killed in battle. So they adopted a lot of white people and black people and whatever. So they watered themselves down. But they're all very practical and very, the traditional people, the clan mothers still run the place. I know a lot of clan mothers personally, and it's wonderful. My last piece of research was in 2012. I spent it at the Mohawk Res, Akwesasne. For the whole month, I did a study of mental health services up there. And I lived with a clan mother, and their big thing on Friday night is drag racing. They have a track on the res, and one of her sons was one of the racers, so we would go, and she would bring all our grandkids, and they'd line up, on either side of us as we watched the races. And I remember this is just an example of what it's like on a reservation. One little kid came tottering up to, he was probably 4 or 5, and he said, "Oh, I want a soda." She said, "Here," gave him $1. He went off into the night. Can you imagine? And then he came back with a soda.
Wow.
It's very safe. She would cook huge pots of food every night, and whoever showed up would eat it. It was really, really nice neighborhood. So the next slide is Again, this was a hunting land, but the Haudenosaunee allowed the Delaware tribe to live there. The Delaware tribe were a peaceful tribe. They had been Christianized by the Moravian missionaries. They had a school there and a church. They were pretty much, white. And there were, people think of, the revolution or whatever, and they never think of the native people who lived there. There were as many or more native people than white people during that whole time, and people just didn't even think about it. And the Haudenosaunee were still fierce and still dangerous. But they were also friendly to certain people. There were people they made friends with, and white people and the Delaware were friends with people. But in 1762, 100 years after Governor Winthrop's deal with the King Charles II, the Connecticut people decided to start to move there. Up until then, they hadn't moved there. It had been 100 years. And they figured we had this land out there if we ever needed it. Well, they decided they needed it. They were having too many children running out of land because they divided the land among the kids. So they started to move that. And that's really when the Yankee-Pennamite War began. So several major battles and events happened. Oh, first this picture of the Haudenosaunee person over on the right is a little bit misleading. Let me read you a description written in 1795, which is in my book on page 118. If you want to look it up. This was written in 1795, describing some Tuscarora braves. They are decked out with uncommon care, covered with rags of every description, and adorned with horsehair and feathers of all possible species of birds. In their ears and noses they wore rings of the most varied forms and colors. Some were dressed in European clothes, others wore laced hats, and some were naked excepting a double apron and painted from head to foot. In general, they prefer the harshest colors, paint one leg white and the other black or green, the body brown or yellow, the face full of red or black spots, and their eyes of different colors. It was like practical. The Haudenosaunee are very practical. You go to a powwow, which is basically a dance contest, and they would have, a 200-year-old drum attached to an amplifier. It's like whatever works, we do. And they're very happy people. They're not at all hostile towards whites. They're very easygoing and live and let live. It's a real interesting culture. But anyway, these big major events happened during this time. Only one of them was really related to the Yankee-Pennamite War. I mean, this war went through the Revolution and through Sullivan's March, and yet it kept going on. So let's start with the first one, which was related, which is the first Wyoming massacre. So when the Connecticut Yankees started to move to Wyoming in 1762, the Haudenosaunee, the Delaware who were living there, and the Pennsylvanians were very upset because they didn't know anything about this at the time, or the ones who knew didn't tell anybody. So the settlers moved in there and were immediately attacked by the people who didn't want them there. And then in April of 1763, the Christian Delaware village in the middle of the Wyoming Valley was mysteriously set afire. This is Teddy Usking, who was the leader of the Delaware, and he was the person who negotiated with the whites when you needed somebody to negotiate with the whites. He was very powerful, very well spoken, very proud, very haughty, and let everyone know he was important. Therefore, the Haudenosaunee didn't like him because their chiefs were supposed to be very modest and not brag. In fact, the Red Jacket, who was very well known, never actually became what's a sachem because he was too well known and too famous. And they wanted people who were, low key and did their duty, but were good people who were not haughty. So I didn't really like this guy. But mysteriously, in April of 1763, the Delaware village was burned down, and Teddy Usking was immolated in his home. So Pennsylvania and the Haudenosaunee immediately blamed the Yankees. That led to the Wyoming massacre, first Wyoming massacre. And that's a picture of it. It tells you something, but let me read you the description. It was pretty rough. So, you know, spoiler alert, it's rough. If anybody's, you know, nervous about hearing awful things. But anyway, I'm sure none of you like that. You're all too old for that. I have to give him grief because he has all these stories which he knows about Timothy, which are fascinating. So we had a little... Anyway, this is in October. So that fire was in April 1763. In October of 1763, Captain Thomas Bull, who was the son of Tidiuskin, led a retaliatory attack on the Connecticut Yankees. 20 men were massacred, 10 of them in horrible fashion, their eyes stuck with awls and spears, arrows and pitchforks thrust into their bodies. One woman was suspended by hinges through her hands and roasted alive. The attackers rushed out of the forest, their faces painted red and black, their cries echoing off the hills above the Susquehanna River as they fell on the unsuspecting settlers. Children watched with horror as a mother was roasted. Men, women, and children ran into the woods, screaming and crying. 2 men were immediately scalped, and several were chased down in the woods and dragged back to the fields where they'd been working in the October sunshine. Blood streaks colored the Susquehanna. The Connecticut settlers, John and Emanuel Hoover, were building a chimney when they were forced to join the captives. Several other adults and child prisoners were herded up the hills from the valley as the attackers blended back into the woodlands. Now, interestingly, also in October, the governor of Pennsylvania, Hamilton, had sent some people to chase the Yankees away about the same time. So we don't know what their role was in all of this. They got there and they said, oh, the massacre had already happened, so we buried the dead.
Wow.
So we don't really know who was involved, but it was kind of nasty for the peaceful Delaware Indians to have done all of that. They were kind of peaceful, and afterwards they were moved so that they wouldn't be, you know, attacked in return. But it was pretty awful massacre. So then the second massacre didn't occur until the American Revolution. That's the next slide. During the American Revolution, most Pennamites sided with the British, which is interesting. And the Yankees sided with the Continental Army, pretty much. And when the Wyoming Valley Yankee men joined, however, they were sent to other battlefields. They weren't left in Pennsylvania. This was by Pennsylvania people in Philadelphia. Oh, it's the Yankees, send them out to, you know, far away. So what happened was the Wyoming Valley itself was left very poorly defended. There were just old men, boys, and women left to defend it. The British leader, John Butler, heard about this and put together 400 British and Tories. Has anyone heard about the Wyoming Massacre? Oh, it's famous down in Pennsylvania. There's signs all over the place and all kinds of stuff. And 500, 700 Haudenosaunee. Again, people think of the American Revolution and they think of guys in blue lined up on one side and guys in red lined up. And it's absolutely not like that at all. For every, 200 British, there were probably 400 or 500 Haudenosaunee with them.
Wow.
They had been won over by the British. Your king is our king, and among the Haudenosaunee, it almost broke the Confederacy because four of the tribes joined the British, and the other 2 were with the Americans, even though they were in the Tuscarora state of the Americans.
Wow.
But anyway, so there were only 375 men in the Wyoming Valley, or men, fighters, boys and men. So the Yankee troops, unaware of the size of the British force, gamely marched out to fight the British playing St. Patrick's Day in the morning with the bedraggled stars and stripes. The Haudenosaunee sent a few warriors out to kind of lure them out until they were in a field where the entire force could surround them. It was a total massacre. 300 of the 375, well, there were 300 people killed.
Wow.
There were very few deaths among the British and Haudenosaunee. And there were all kinds of rumors about this, of awful things that had happened there. And they still haven't been proven, but there was a story about one woman who had a big rock and would take prisoners. She was Haudenosaunee clan mother, and put them on this rock with their heads in a row and go around and smash the heads and all that. And the Haudenosaunee say that absolutely was not true. She wasn't even there, and stuff like that. But if you go down to the Wyoming Valley of Pennsylvania, you can see the rock, which is about 2 inches high, by the way. It's the only rock they could find, I guess, to attribute this thing to. But history is interesting. I'm sure even talking about the history of Timothy Pickering, there are so many different stories, and you really don't know for sure which one is right. But that was the second Wyoming massacre, and again, the Pennamites were on the British side pretty much. There was one Pennamite, however, Wintermoot, who had a little fort in the area, and he, of course, let the British stay there. They got together before they went to fight, and as the Americans were coming out, his bosses, the British, decided to burn his fort to make them think they were retreating. He was like, "Well, wait a minute, I put you up," and they're like, "Oh well, we have to do this."
Oh.
I don't know if we changed sides, but maybe. So the next slide is General Sullivan. You've heard of General Sullivan's March, probably, because that was having to do with the Haudenosaunee. This was as a result of the massacre of the Wyoming Valley. The rumors got back that things were horrific and all these awful things had happened. And also the Haudenosaunee, especially the Seneca, were kind of annoyed that they'd gotten a bad rap for this, and so they went and started massacring people up in New York. Cherry Valley occurred, and that was pretty nasty. So in 1779, Congress directed a campaign to go and punish the Haudenosaunee. So they put this guy, Sullivan, in charge, who was a fairly recent immigrant or son of immigrants from Ireland. And he started out way down at the beginning of the Susquehanna River. Everything started down there and went up. This was a regular trail. And there was a great swamp here that they all had to go through. And there were mountains. It was very, very treacherous going up here. But he had 100 to 200 boats, 1,400 pack horses, 200 cattle. And then Major General James Clinton was supposed to come down from Otsego Lake and meet him in what is now Elmira, which was Tioga. And they met in August, and by then they had 4,000 men, several hundred cattle, over 1,000 horses, and 9 cannon. The trails were very treacherous. Cows fell off the trails, When they got to the town, which is now known as Horseheads, they murdered a bunch of horses, which were in such bad shape they couldn't go on. And somebody lined them up again along a road, which is where the name Horseheads came from. And if you go to the town of Horseheads in lower New York State, has anyone been there?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's I guess a road, I don't know, something with a big picture of horses on it. Not Horseheads. But anyway, it was very treacherous. The Haudenosaunee, as I say, were very practical. And they were like, uh-oh, let's get out of here. So they basically ran away. They only had 2 interactions where they actually fought with the British and killed a few British, but they basically took off. And there are diaries of the guys who were on this march. And they're fascinating because they went fishing, they drank a lot of rum, they found log cabins. They expected, I don't know what they expected, huts. There were log cabins with feather beds. There were orchards. There were, all kinds of fruits and vegetables. It was very civilized. And there were also pots left on the stove because they would see them coming and they would just take off. So a lot of them went to Ontario, where Six Nations was founded, and a lot of them are still up there. But eventually they wandered back. Because of this, the President of the U.S. was given the name Town Destroyer. And that is now the name of every U.S. president in the Haudenosaunee world, Town Destroyer. I don't know if you knew that. It's down in the Peabody Museum. If you go down there. We went down there yesterday. And I was happy to see they had that. So Trump is known as Town Destroyer. That was pretty cool. but anyway. So, okay, next slide. Meanwhile, the Yankee-Pennamite Wars continued. After the first Wyoming massacre, the Connecticut Yankees came back, 1769. I mean, they still thought they had absolute right to be there. Both sides began to model their attacks after those of the Haudenosaunee, the most powerful people they knew. So they would put blackface on and wear feathers and do war whoops and. As
So these
time-
were white settlers.
white settlers, yeah.
Okay. The Pennamites.
The Pennamites were from Pennsylvania and the Yankees were from Connecticut.
Okay.
And they both started doing this. And as time went on, they got worse and worse. And the Susquehanna company, which is the one who paid the settlers to move there originally, has a bunch of volumes about its business. And one of them, volume 9, has all this stuff in it about what happened during that. And they asked them to sign oaths of loyalty to Pennsylvania and asked them to support different people who were on the Pennsylvania side, and it's a very fascinating book. It's if you want to find that, it's really good. Susquehanna Valley Papers. But anyway, it went on and it didn't let up. It got worse as time went on because they weren't getting anywhere. So the next one. Now we get to kidnapping. Timothy Pickering arrived in Wilkes-Barre to quell the disturbance in 1787. One of the first things he did was jail the leader of the Yankees, Colonel John Franklin, that I mentioned earlier. Franklin was very popular. He had been in the Revolution, he'd been on Sullivan's March, everyone loved him, he was one of the big heroes of the time. This is his gravestone, a stand I found with much difficulty down in the Louisiana area. And, but, I mean, I have to say, Timothy Pickering, when he got there, tried very hard to make everybody happy. He got them to try to agree, he had meetings, he had them sign oaths of loyalty, and he talked to them, but meanwhile, Colonel Franklin was running up and down the valley on his horse and saying to everybody, let's get rid of this guy's no good, we gotta get rid of him, and after a while Pickering got annoyed, so he threw him in jail.
Did he come with a military force, or did he come as a diplomat?
He came as a diplomat. Yeah, exactly. With his kids, living in that big house. And that was pretty brave, I guess. Well, he thought that Pennsylvania people would support him, which they did. I mean, they were still being polite at that point, you know, to some extent. Except when they ran out of the woods and murdered each other's cattle. But, you know, nothing is easy, you know? There were some people who were peaceful and some who weren't, some who played both sides. There were Haudenosaunee who played both sides, you know. During the Wyoming massacre, one of the Haudenosaunee Mohawks went up to some people who were Yankees and said, you better get out of here because it's not what you think. These British are coming and they have many more men than you do. And he's like, oh, well, you know, I don't know how to do this. Here, take my horse. And he got him on the horse with his kid and they took off. So, you know, it's really hard to know who your friends were. Which is the story of our history, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, Pickering actually at the time was quartermaster for Washington. The war was over, he didn't have a job, so he convinced Philadelphia to send him up there. He had bought land up there, and he wanted to protect his land partly. So, as soon as he jailed Franklin, the leaders of the Yankees got together and said, let's kidnap Pickering and trade him for Franklin. It was crazy in retrospect. At the time, it sounded like a good idea. They had these young bucks, these young wild Yankees. They ranged in age from 15 to 29, these guys. And they were used to, you know, running out of the woods, putting on blackface with their tomahawks and having a good old time. And they were like, sure, we'll kidnap him.
Early versions of the Proud Boys.
Yeah, seems,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, their fate was a lot worse, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, So they were up for it, and John Jenkins, who was one of the leaders, said to them they would give him land in return. You go and kidnap this guy and take him in the woods, and after we trade him, we'll give you land and we'll give you money, and you'll have a good time. It'll be a frolic, quote unquote. Yeah. So the wild Yankees kidnapped him. After 19 days, he convinced them that their friends were not going to come to help them, and that he would never release Franklin. So after 19 days in the woods, they let him go. So what is the connection to my ancestor, John Earle? This is a painting I did, which is in the background of a couple of slides of one of the boys carrying Pickering on his back so he wouldn't get his feet wet.
Oh my goodness. What does that image come from?
I did that. I did a painting. It's I was going to donate it to Pickering House, but I asked you about it, and you were like, I didn't know if I really should, but if you think I should, I'll send it to you.
Well,
He came to one of my art. I'm an artist in Maine. That's what I do. That's what I'm known as.
He's still a pretty young man, isn't he, at this point? 30s, maybe?
Yeah.
Pickering, let's see,
Well, 1 in 45.
45, right? So he would be
So he's in his
in
40s.
40s, in his 40s. So you're saying he was prematurely gray, maybe?
Probably bald at that point though.
Silver fox.
But he had a cool nose.
Yeah, they all do.
He doesn't. He didn't get the nose. But if you look at this, you see it, among the kidnappers are 3 Earls: Benjamin, Daniel, and Solomon. Daniel and Solomon were brothers, I think. And Benjamin, I think, was their cousin. The Earls were all over the place, and there were lots and lots of Earls all over the place. Doing Earl genealogy is up there. Smith's genealogy or Brown genealogy. really, really awful. But these were basically sons of the Great Migration from 1620 to 1640, where all the people came from England, the first Great Migration. And they were all, merchants and carpenters and, middle-class people. They were normal youngsters. The 3 Earl boys were, according to the records that I found, except Timothy Pickering's diary, he kept voluminous diaries, he said 2 of them were the sons of a guy named Joseph Earle. But according to everything else, all 3 were sons of Joseph Earle. And Joseph Earle was probably the same Joseph Earle who was up in Vermont right before this. He bought land down in the area in 1785. And his home was a staging area for Ethan Allen's attack on Fort Ticonderoga.
Oh wow.
And he was probably one of the Green Mountain Boys, which I've been up there, they have horrible records. So I don't know for sure. But Ethan Allen actually came down to the Wyoming Valley at one point and was on the Yankee side and agitated in favor of the Yankees. Yeah, so he encouraged them. So next slide is Timothy Pickering's journal about the kidnapping, which is kind of interesting. Again, they carried, you can see him, those are the boys in their canoe. And the first one is, the water was low and the canoe touched the bottom before we reached the shore. He sent these notes to his son. I don't know which son, but probably the oldest one. I was going to step out and wave to the shore. Stop, said one of them, who had a pack on his back. He waded to the shore, laid down his pack, returned to the side of the canoe, and carried me on his back to the shore. And that was in italics in his journal. Another one is a fire being quickly kindled, they began to cook some of the venison. Being hungry, I borrowed one of their knives. So I guess he wasn't too much under control. And followed their example. I observed the hunter tending his steak with great nicety and sprinkling it with a little salt. As soon as it was done, with a very good grace, presented it to me. Again in italics. Wrote to my wife for camlet coat, 2 pairs worsted hose, 1 shirt, 1 pocket handkerchief, 1 towel, needle, thread, yarn, leather gloves, 4 yards yellow binding, a bag with chocolate, pounded chocolate. I don't know if you know this about Timothy Pickering. He was really into chocolate.
I didn't know.
Yes. When he went to Harvard, he took chocolate with him. Yeah.
This is quite a list for somebody who's been kidnapped.
You're right.
Yeah.
1 pound sugar. I guess he liked sugar too.
That tracks.
one half paper. You still like sugar? Genetic. Shoes, 2 quills, penknife, got a penknife. Dr. Price's sermons and a fine comb. Sent a large wooden spoon and butter spoon to Kilburn's Kilburn's were kidnappers, 2 of the kidnappers from Kilburn, to be sent thence to my wife. Gave Woodward a letter dated yesterday to forward to my wife. Desired her to send me a small tin kettle with a cover. Woodward returned, says my things are at Marcy's with a letter for me. Colonel Franklin, they said, this is later in his journal. Colonel Franklin, they said, had been put in irons in the Philadelphia jail, and they must put irons on me, although it was not agreeable to them to do it. But their great men required it. This chain, besides its conformity with the orders of their great men, saved my gentlemen from the burden of mounting guard every night. When we lay down, they placed me in the middle, and one of them wrapped the chain around one of his legs so that I could not rise to attempt an escape without waking him up. So that was his adventure with chains. And they told him all about farming. He didn't really know much about farming. They told him, how to take care of a sow after she's had babies, and how to plow a field with oxen so you don't knock the corn down, and how to make coffee out of bark and stuff. And he said, "'Tis quite an agreeable drink." So, they appeared to be very friendly. And he kept telling them, "Look, if you let me go, I'll watch out for you. Don't worry about it, So after 19 days, they gave up. They let him go. Next slide. However, on July 8th, he was let go on July 15th. There was already a bounty out for them. This is fun to read because it's got X instead of S's.
Yes.
I don't know if you can see it, but it's hard to read. But basically, it says basically in effect that these guys took Pickering, and there was a bounty out for them, and it was $300 for John Jenkins and John Hyde, who were the leaders, the great men who put them up to it, and a $100 bounty for Daniel Earle, Benjamin Earle, and a bunch of the other guys. He left there. A few of the names are left off there, but basically that was what they wanted to do. They wanted to capture him and jail him. They had to pay. They would get a bounty if they did. One of them had been shot in a skirmish. Gideon Dudley had his hand shot when he was in a skirmish on July 4th. This was July 8th that this came out. So they were already out in the woods looking for them. And there's a story about looking for the boys on the next slide. This is the story of Benjamin Earle. Within days of the kidnapping, in the dead of night, there was a knock on the door of Benjamin Earle's cabin. This is kidnapping release, basically. His new wife, a buxom lass who was twice his size. The Earles are still a little, soft dick. I fight it constantly. His new wife, a buxom lass who was twice his size, stuck her panic spouse in the feather bed where he sank to the bottom, and placed a considerable self on top of him, so that it appeared only one person was in the bed.
Oh my goodness.
She then said to Constable Westover, "Come in, who's there?" Westover, "Come, Earle, you're my prisoner." And he entered the room with a light. "For shame, Mr. Westover," said Mrs. Earle. "I here a lone woman to be so encroached upon. But where is Ben? He was expecting the writ and didn't think he was such a fool as to be at home. He has more wit than that, I hope."
Squish.
Squish, right? Satisfied the lady was alone, Westover retired. So Benjamin was actually captured and jailed eventually, and he turned state's witness on the other boys.
Oh, wow.
Survived.
He stayed down, and the rest of them all left. He's still, his descendants are still there, and I'm in contact with them. I found them. And I'm like, "Oh, you're Benjamin. He's here now." The rat.
Small rat.
Yeah.
Small rat. Right. So the next slide is Pickering's notes, you can barely see that outline, but again, that's the same picture. This was dated August 7, but it's actually around July 29, because one of the boys who's mentioned here, Joseph Dudley, who was the brother of the guy who had the shot in the hand, was actually the only one of them who was killed. He died from his wounds. He was shot by one of the posses on July 29th. But if you see here, they continued to hide out after they let him go. And he says they went to the lakes, fled through the Great Swamp. As I showed you before, the Great Swamp was kind of up near the New York border. They fled to the lakes, that's the Finger Lakes, flying toward Tioga, which is toward Elmira. Two of them were caught, Ira Manville and Benedict Satterley. They were in jail. And when they were released, a couple of years later, the Susquehanna Company gave them land for their difficulties. And Joseph Dudley died, and Joseph's death was noted by Pickering in a letter to Benjamin Franklin on July 29th. He said, one of them is in jail here. Oops, he doesn't look good. I think he's not going to make it. And then in a later paragraph, he said, oh, I was just told he died.
Wow.
His letters and journals are fascinating. Have you read his journals?
So we get
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're really interesting.
He's really a storyteller.
Yeah,
His letters
storyteller.
to one of his son, Henry Pickering, those are quite, when he reminisces those years, when he was in his last decades of life. It's actually very nice too.
Yeah,
to read.
he's a good writer.
Mhm.
And very, very easy to read too.
Mm-hmm.
Even in his last decade, like it's.
Hmm.
So the next slide. On September 2nd, the kidnappers were actually indicted along with their leaders. And this basically mentions their names, and then it says, the 26th of June in nighttime in the year of our Lord 1788 with force and arms, viz. With guns, knives, and tomahawks, riotously, rootously, and unlawfully to disturb the peace of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, did assemble themselves and meet together. And so being assembled, having their faces painted and disfigured, the mansion of Timothy Pickering then and there, with force and arms, to wit, with guns, knives, tomahawks, did break and enter, and in and upon the said Timothy Pickering, then being, with force and arms, as aforesaid, an assault did make. At least it does the right S's. And the said Timothy Pickering then and there did beat, wound, and evilly treat, and him the said Timothy Pickering, having first bound him with cords to distant parts of this country, did carry, and there cruelly, carry was actually a good word to use, but they didn't realize that, because they carried him on their back.
Mhm.
And there cruelly and ignominiously put him in chains and kept him prisoner for 19 days, exposed to their insults and the inclemency of the weather, so that of his life it was greatly despaired. The indictment sounded quite different from his journal.
Right.
Very.
But it kind of got out of his hands, you know? And I think he went, you know, what are you going to do? No, they were really nice. No, it's not going to work. But they gave you that, no. Right, they gave you venison, sure.
What about the insult?
What an insult.
He brought chocolate. Of course he
Right.
did.
Yeah, right.
That was for them, it wasn't for me.
Right.
Yeah. But anyway, the kidnappers were all convicted of riot. He did have an effect on that. They wanted to give them treason. Fined 7 to 9 pounds, and those who were captured were put in jail. Benjamin Earle was not punished, and he turned state's witness. And he named one of his children Beach Earle. One of the leaders was named Beach. The leaders were John Jenkins, John Franklin, Beach, and McKinstry. McKinstry, I think, was from New York. But anyway, they did have very important men behind all of this, who they barely saw. But they were having a good time. So where did they go? Next slide. They went to the Phelps and Gorham Purchase, basically. I don't know if you can see this little circle here. That's where John Earle, my ancestor, was born.
Oh.
So in 1788, Oliver Phelps and Nathaniel Gorham purchased this land in the Finger Lakes, which had belonged to the Seneca. Remember the Sullivan's March? After Sullivan's March, the land was basically taken over by the U.S. The Haudenosaunee were still pretty powerful, so they were careful. So it was 2.5 million acres. It was given to Massachusetts for $1 million, who Phelps and Gorham then paid the Haudenosaunee $5,000, just for title. So in 1789, some of the kidnappers started to work surveying the land and building homes for themselves in upstate New York. John Whitcomb, who was one of the kidnappers, got married in Geneva in 1789. This is the first non-native marriage in Geneva, New York. He had several children, and around 1810 he moved back to Pennsylvania, to the Wyoming Valley. The Kilbournes eventually went to Canada. The rest of them still stayed around there. I've been doing lectures up in this area of New York State, and I always say, when I show the names of the kidnappers, anybody related? Let's have a reunion. Let's have a kidnapper reunion. Nobody ever says anything. One guy said to me, well, I'm a descendant of Pennamites.
Oh.
Yeah. He said, and your Susquehanna River's not white. You didn't do that right. So, anyway, he was kind of a difficult guy, interestingly. Some people bear grudges. I don't. I loved him. He's such
There you
a
go.
Yeah. Anyway, so lot number 12. What Geneva was like at this time. Let me read you from my book what it was like in Geneva when they were there. It was not like Philadelphia. Philadelphia was like Europe. It was really nice. But Geneva, this is from a diary of a person who was living there. Soon after my father had come on west of the river and opened a public house, other settlers began to come in. The Indians were frequent visitors to my father's. I used to see them often, the chiefs, Hot Bread, Jackberry, Red Jacket, and Little Beard. We brought in a few sheep with us. They became the special object of the wolves. Coming out of the Wilson Swamp nights, their howling would be terrific. I could tell many stories of wild beasts in this region. We had no way to keep fowls, but to secure them well in their roosting places. The first settlers found it difficult to keep hogs. The bears would come out of the woods and take them by daylight.
Wow.
That's what it was like in Geneva in
Wild
1795.
country.
It was very wild. So try to find school records or even church records. They had wandering ministers. Yeah. So there's a story about Solomon Earle. He was one of the surveyors on lot number 12.
Sorry. Sorry.
That was nice. That was a nice little interlude. Yeah.
So early spring 1789. Remember the kidnapping had been in 1788 in summer. Surveyors from the Wyoming Valley on lot number 12 of the Phelps and Gorham purchase included Yankee leaders John Jenkins and John Swift, as well as Solomon Earle, Alpheus Harris, nephew of John Jenkins, Daniel Ransom, Mr. Baker. They were all Yankees. Tuscarora Braves shot through the chinks between the logs. Solomon Earle was shot in the jaw. Mr. Baker was killed. Earle was taken to Geneva, and the next day the Tuscarora returned to steal food. Tuscarora were chased to Newton, Elmira's name then, where a trial occurred. One brave was tomahawked and the other beaten to death. And this is listed in the area as the first trial in Genesee County. Things were rough. Yeah. The Haudenosaunee by this time were discouraged and hungry. They'd lost their feather beds, not to mention their houses and their fruit trees and everything. Many went to Canada. Others learned to live alongside the Americans. One of the Tuscarora who was in on this attack was named Turkey. He was well known to the settlers, and he got smallpox during the War of 1812 when he fought on the American side. Well, the Tuscarora did side with the Americans anyway, but that didn't keep them from losing their land and their livelihood and everything. He got smallpox, was taken to a hut in the woods to die by his relatives, so he was very well known. Solomon then became a ferryman on Seneca Lake. Daniel Earle was also mentioned in these early stories about the Finger Lakes. And it appears the whole Joseph Earle family lived in the area in the early 1790s. There are land records of a whole bunch of them. And there were two more brothers named William and John. I'm not sure which one of these people are my ancestor. I really don't know. The oral history that I do have is that John Earle from Geneva's father had been abducted as a child and raised by the Haudenosaunee, abducted in the Wyoming Valley, which is definitely possible. Could have happened even during the first massacre when they brought captives up to New York. And if you were adopted by the Haudenosaunee, you became Haudenosaunee. And he was repatriated during Sullivan's March, because when Sullivan's people went up through Haudenosaunee land, if they saw any white people, they repatriated them. They didn't want to be repatriated necessarily. But supposedly he was repatriated, married a white woman, and moved to Michigan. And so I have actually Earle relatives who gave me this story in Michigan. So, but I have no proof. So that's where I got my Peterbilt blood. So it's way back.
Sorry, I wasn't sure when to ask a question. You're talking about the addition of the E. Do you know when it happened? And why?
Yeah, my great grandfather did genealogy and didn't like what he found, destroyed it, and added an E to the name.
That makes sense.
Yeah, 'cause there are a lot of Earls, many Earls from England, many prominent Earls, well-known Earls, not kidnappers. So either found the Cayuga blood or the kidnappers, I don't know which,
Wow.
or something else. Who knows? But in any case, but I still have kidnapper blood, I'm sure. So it looks like that was him, but anyway, okay. Timothy Pickering. So, in October 1790, Pickering was appointed as a special emissary to a disgruntled group of Seneca who felt cheated in the sale of their land. They were originally offered $10,000, not $5,000. They got $5,000. And the other thing was they said it wasn't really valid because there were 50 chiefs among the Haudenosaunee and only a few chiefs had signed the agreement to sell their land. So they were very unhappy. So Pickering was sent to straighten this out. And he actually was very sympathetic to Haudenosaunee, and he said, yeah, you probably were ripped off, and they were wrong to do this, and he took their side, much to everyone's surprise. And he was given a name on the side of the hill by Red Jacket. Now, getting a name from the Haudenosaunee is a great honor. On the side of the hill, I don't know where that would come from. It's not, Peacemaker, but it's not Town Destroyer either, on the side of the hill. I really don't know where that came from. But anyway, he did a good job as emissary. He was supposedly given the Postmaster General as an award for his good work for the Haudenosaunee. He was given that title in 1791. But he continued working with the Haudenosaunee, and in 1794 he negotiated what I call the Fort Stanwix Treaty, but Canandaigua Treaty is the other name. And you probably know a lot more about that than I do. There are all kinds of things around the house which I had meant to read before I gave the speech, but the important thing to me was that he was well liked by them, and they still have celebrations up there where Timothy Pickering is a huge hero. He then was appointed Secretary of State and Secretary of War. Secretary of War first, because Secretary of War at that time was someone who dealt with the native tribes. So he had done such a good job with the Haudenosaunee, they figured he could deal with the Western tribes as well. Then he became Secretary of State, 1795, the actual year my ancestor was born, up in Geneva. As for the Yankee-Pennamite War, you know, a couple times they thought they'd ended the war. In 1773, they said the land belonged to Connecticut. In 1782, the Trent Decree said it belonged to Pennsylvania. But it wasn't really resolved until after this all happened. And then Connecticut was given some land in Ohio, and Pennsylvania decided that they would let the Yankees stay if they paid a small fee. And so they did, and some of them went back, and the ones in jail were given more land. And so it kind of resolved itself over time. Franklin refused to pay for his land. He lived on his land. But when he died, they made his sons pay. So that's the end of the story.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. If anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
I do. Forgive me for coming in late. I had my schedule wrong. But why exactly did they kidnap him? You know, he brought chocolate.
Well, he had jailed their leader, and so their other leaders wanted to trade. So they said, "Go get Pickering, and we'll trade him for our guy who's in jail." And so they were just kind of pawns in the game of life.
Mm.
So that's a line from what, Stan?
Blazing Saddles.
Blazing
That's
Saddles.
right.
Yes.
What's the name of that guy?
Mongo.
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 Mongo just pawn in the game.
Less of a question, more just a comment. It's funny how Pickering's kind of diplomatic bend seems to keep coming up, and he wasn't much of a farmer, it seems, until he went out to Pennsylvania. And it's interesting how that interest and that, you know, these were like real frontiersmen.
Oh
You know,
yeah.
guys who like had to be self-sufficient. You know, this
Right.
was like the absolute edge of what was then, you know, America, you know, the United States, I should say. And so that kind of diplomatic bend bleeding into farming, Society of Cincinnati type ideals, you know, they had served in the war, put down a sword, pick up the plow, and I think kind of Pickering continually embodies that in my mind. And it's just interesting how I always thought, oh, you know, he was a citizen farmer and he had these values, but it's cool because this was really his first opportunity to own his own farm.
Yeah.
From what I understand his history, he didn't own significant land before that. During the Revolution, he was fighting, and so it's kind of cool that I feel that we can pretty easily trace his farming interests and that, you know, kind of self-sufficient Yankee, we have to figure this out and make do with what we got type attitude that seems to keep popping up. And even the Essex Agricultural Society, which is the organization today that continues that legacy that Colonel Tim founded in the 1821. Was it 1818? Yeah. So yeah, it's just interesting that this, you know, in my mind, this is probably the closest place that I can say, here's where he got that interest in that.
Well, it's interesting. He did keep voluminous notes about all the things they told him how to do.
Yeah.
You know, so
Practical farming.
practical farming. Yeah, that's very interesting.
I had always assumed that he owned this house. I guess I'm wrong.
He
This
was
house-
born here.
Born here, but didn't own it.
Was the Johns.
I think his grandfather owned it, right?
Well, his dad, and then his dad gave it to his older brother, John V. John V never had any children, and so Colonel Timothy's oldest son, John Pickering VI, grew up here in the home while his father was off fighting in the war. Didn't actually spend a lot of time with his dad, John Pickering VI, that is. And then when John V passed away, he ended up giving the house to his nephew, Colonel Tim's son. So that was one of the few instances it didn't go from the father to the son, it went from the uncle to the nephew.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The other thing that's interesting is that this wasn't the only land battle that was going on. There were battles for Vermont and Massachusetts and Maine, all going on between Maine and Massachusetts at the same time. And it was all very wild, and you know, they were all attacking each other. But this is one thing that you think they would have known about, because it went on for 40 years. You know, and it was pretty bloody and pretty crazy. And yeah.
I'm curious if in doing your research, did Pickering mislead them in that the kidnappers is saying, hey, you know, let me go and I'll help you get away with, you know, minimize your punishment, or did he?
I think he thought maybe he could at that time, but then when he got out, he found out there was a bounty for them.
And once that was out of his
it was
control.
too late. Yeah, and
But they didn't die of treason.
no,
Right.
Because
no,
treason
they
is
weren't
death
accused of
penalty.
treason. No,
Yeah.
they weren't.
This was
So Yeah, it did have some effect. He did. He said he actually argued in their favor and said, "These guys have nothing. They're dirt poor. You can't do this because they would starve." And you know, during his captivity, Joseph Earle, they stayed overnight at Joseph Earle's house at one point, and one of the boys wanted to put tie his wrists, and Joseph Earle said, "No, you don't need to tie. He said, it's fine." And so when he let him go, a lot of people wanted him to jail the fathers too. And he said, no, he really didn't have part in it. He let Joseph Earle go. And a few of the other fathers who had, provided supplies and stuff. So I'm sure he was ambivalent because they were nice to him and it wasn't a horrible time, But on the other hand, they had kidnapped him and kidnapping is illegal. So, it's hard to know. People get swept up in these things and,
One of the other things that this kind of speaks to me too was this was all during the Articles of the Confederacy period before the U.S. Constitution was ratified, and this really goes to show the weakness of the federal government in that period, where their top officials were getting kidnapped. Shays' Rebellion in 1786, I think it was, in Western Massachusetts. And that was again, these farmers rising up against the federal government. And it wasn't a land dispute; it was around economic conditions at the time, but. I think that was one of these two incidents were major things on people's mind about, hey, we need a stronger federal government. And of course, Colonel Timothy was also a big advocate for a strong central federal government. So it's quite telling that, I think this again, influencing his later politics, we can see that.
Yep. So, I used for Timothy Pickering, I used a biography which this Timothy Pickering is now reading, and he said it's horrific. It really is nasty about Timothy
Very
Pickering.
critical.
What a bad, very critical.
Oh, no.
But that's the only one I read. So, but over time I've read other stuff like Canandaigua stuff and other stuff, and also his journals that made me think he wasn't as bad as
Right.
What biography?
made him out to be. By Clarfield, a guy named Clarfield.
Gerald Clarfield.
Yeah, Gerald Clarfield. That's right.
It's quite a contrast between the frolic of being kidnapped and getting roasted alive in the first massacre. What do you think the differing degrees of savagery mean?
Well, I don't think the Yankees roasted anybody alive. It was them being roasted alive. It was the Haudenosaunee and the Delaware. And the Haudenosaunee were nasty. I mean, they did nasty stuff. They would take somebody's intestine and tie it to a tree and then make the person walk around the tree and stuff like that. They were nasty, but that was their culture. They taught little kids how to peel people's ears. It's just what they did. And I mean the British did nasty stuff too, but for the Haudenosaunee it became an art.
What was the name? What did Mohawk mean? What was that?
Mohawk meant man-eater.
Yeah.
Man.
Really?
They were tough. They were tough.
A name that they chose themselves or something that other tribes
That was given to them, Mohawk, by the Massachusetts tribes, I think.
Oh, wow.
Good question.
Because they were cannibals?
No, they just were tough.
Yeah, the Massachusetts tribes were terrified of the tribes from New York and Maine.
They were, they were.
Yeah.
For good reason. But among themselves, the Haudenosaunee were, Let's see, there's a movie, Black Robe, which is about the Jesuits coming to Quebec and then going among the Haudenosaunee. It's really a good movie and it gives you a pretty good picture of what was going on at the time. It's really a great movie.
Wow.
See that? So that guy, it was Timothy Pickering, The American Republic, 1980. And I went to the library and looked for biographies of Timothy Pickering. That's what they had in Maine. So that's
They didn't have the life of Timothy Pickering?
not in my library in Ann Arbor.
We'll have to give a donation up there then.
You might want to send some books up there.
No, good idea, yeah.
But anyway, this has been great. I'm just
Thank you.
thrilled to
Thank
meet
you.
Timothy
Thank you.
Pickering. Well,
Thank you.